Good evening. Good evening. We're going to start as soon as I corral the two Freds. And it's important to know before we begin that both of them preferred being called Fred, but I said I didn't know who would be Fred 1 and who would be Fred 2. So when I speak about Fred Upton, I will be speaking either, I will call him Congressman or Representative, and when I ask Fred Johnson a question, I will call him Professor. So that should handle, and so it's not 1 or 2.
It's better than my initials, okay?
But he's... You got some?
Takes a little while.
You know that if you have your question card filled out, just raise your hand with the card and David will come and get it, or Bob. I want to welcome you all. My name is Claudia Berry, and I am the current president of HASP. We welcome those of you here in the audience, wonderful crowd, and we also welcome those of you joining us online. It is important now that you all check your cell phones and make sure you have turned off your cell phone, because we wouldn't want cell phones ringing while Fred 1 and Fred 2 are speaking. If you wear hearing aids, as I do, please note that this Miller Auditorium is accessible with a T-coil, and you can put your hearing aids on, and that should help if you're struggling hearing some of the answers that are given tonight. HASP is a lifelong learning organization, and we are delighted to bring you this special evening illustrating how history is relevant in today's world. Tonight's conversation's topic between former Congressman Fred Upton and Hope College professor Fred Johnson is "The Fix for a Fractured Congress: What History Teaches Us and What We Can Do." As we begin this evening's conversation, we ask that everyone join in respectful civil discourse. Let us remember that respect is not the absence of strong opinions. It is the presence of thoughtful dialogue. Let us lean into hard conversations with open minds and steady hearts. Thank you. Fred Upton, a former U.S. representative from Michigan who served in Congress from 1987 to 2023, representing the state's 6th congressional district since 1993. A member of the Republican Party, Upton was known for his moderate stance and efforts at bipartisan cooperation, notably co-authoring the 21st Century Cures Act to accelerate medical research and innovation. Upton announced his retirement in 2022, citing redistricting and the changing dynamics within the Republican Party. Dr. Fred Johnson is the Guy Vanderjack 1953 Endowed Professor of History at Hope College, where he has taught since 2000. Specializing in 19th century U.S. history with a focus on the Civil War. His academic interests also encompasses U.S. history, military history, foreign policy, and African history. A former U.S. Marine Corps officer, thanks, Bob, Dr. Johnson brings a unique perspective to his teaching, enriched by his diverse professional background in corporate training and telecommunications. Please welcome our two Freds. Tonight, I will be acting as the moderator for the conversation, which will last approximately 1 hour. At the end of the conversation, I will open it up and we will begin to ask the questions that you in the audience have provided. So before we begin, does anybody have any questions right now that need to be picked up from David or Bob? Okay, I think we are good. Are you ready?
Ready and willing. Fire away.
Fire away.
Fire in the hole.
Fire away. Okay. We're going to begin by sort of framing the conversation. So, Representative Upton, could you briefly outline the constitutional roles and principal duties of the United States Congress?
Well, I will be brief. First of all, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a constitutional expert. I learned civics from a great teacher, Mr. Denicus, back in St. Joe, back in 9th grade, and believe strongly in the 3 branches of government and checks and balances, and fortunately to have the opportunity to work for my local congressman and then work at the White House under President Reagan, and then a number of people came to convince me to run for Congress, and I said, no, thank you. Never was in my long-term plan, and they came back to me, convinced us to run, and we won 25 contested elections. But where I'm heading is I'm a Reagan Republican, if you remember that. A guy who worked with a Democratic Congress, and at the end of the day, and I saw this, really a perspective of working within the administration, the executive branch, and then working in the legislative branch, a guy that with a Democratic Congress, and part of the executive branch is you want to get reelected. That is the drive, the first term. You want to get reelected. His test was he won 49 states when he ran for reelection. A Republican winning California, Massachusetts, New York, Illinois. I mean, unheard of today. But he did it because he loved the place. He wanted to govern, and he had Tip O'Neill and others at the White House, and I was part of those meetings every week. He had a relationship, and things worked, and the country was proud. And we were going through some tough times, inflation over 15%, the Soviet Union with the fall of the Berlin Wall later on. I mean, all of those different dimensions, the Cold War. But he got things done because he learned the process, and he worked with the members, and that was my style in Congress. I wanted to work with, when I was elected, I think we had maybe 162 Republicans. 218 is the magic number to get something passed. So if it was just Republicans, you're going to lose every time by a ton. So work with the Democrats, and I could talk of lots of examples, but to get things done. And you had the checks and balances, and that's sadly not what I see today. It is really, really different. And, as I listen to people from all across the country, most of the country is not real happy with the direction that we're right now, and it's because of the big change that I know we're going to talk about during the course of the next hour and a half. So my sense was, bottom line, Constitution, checks and balances, equal levels of the branches of government, and you have the court system to sort of govern what the legislative branch does. You have a president that can sign legislation or veto it, but at the end of the day, the House has to work with the Senate to get things done. That was my MO.
Thank you. Professor Johnson, from your perspective, are there any additional aspects you would highlight regarding the roles, powers, and duties of Congress?
Well, Claudia, I'm gonna frame that by quoting from the movie Charlie Wilson's War. There's a line, you recall Charlie Wilson was a congressman from Texas
I served with Charlie.
who funneled, or at least according to the movie, funneled or made it possible to funnel Stinger missiles to the Afghan Mujahideen when the Soviets invaded. And in the course of the movie, one of Charlie's funders says, "Charlie, why is Congress saying one thing and doing nothing?" He responds, "Mostly tradition." Well, what I want to speak on relative to Claudia's question is, Congress is, like Congressman Upton said, of course, there's checks and balances in all the functionalities of Congress, but Congress serves also an important societal role. And that as an institution, as a cultural institution, Congress stands as something that we just have assumed would always be there, was inviolable, and was an expression of the best and our worst impulses and functions of government. So we have spent 200 plus years calling ourselves a democracy, which, depending upon what neighborhood you lived in, maybe that was true more or less. But our culture is one of democratic republicanism, or Republican democracy, that a representative democracy, not a perfect one, a representative democracy. Part of that cultural imprint means that Congress is also supposed to be modeling the best of civic engagement, which would include things like Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan fighting in public and then going out to have a drink later on that evening. Or freedom of expression. The Senate has been called the world's greatest deliberative body. One wonders if we can still say that. Tolerance and inclusion, two dirty words today. Critical thinking, of which there has always never been an overabundant amount. Open dialogue and debate. And this is the last two, which I think is what's really rattling people's cages today, is supposed to stand relative to its Article 1 powers in the Constitution for the respect for the rule of law. And also emphasizing the fact that no one is above the law. This point about no one being above the law means equality under the law, transparency of the law, and independent judiciary, and access to legal remedies. Now, you can look at the history of this business, and every country around the world that's either been a dictatorship or slid into tyranny, the legal part of that nation has essentially either been compromised or neutered altogether. We are hanging on by a thread because we have an independent judiciary for the moment, but pressure is being applied in ways that we haven't seen for several decades. Rule of law, respect for the law, no one above the law. If we lose that, we've lost more than what you can realize. So, as a cultural institution showing us what it means to be a democracy, Congress is supposed to function in a way that models for us how we should be engaging with each other. But when you have people who are as far apart from each other as East is from West, that is a reflection of who they are, and they're reflecting who we are as well. The dysfunctionality is not new. Congress has always been in some form of crisis. That's not new. But what is new is the unwillingness to cross aisles and solve problems, and that is govern, and then most of all, put the Constitution above party and self, and also elevate nation as well. The Founding Fathers could not have imagined a day when people would be willfully, intentionally overruling the Constitution.
Thank you, Fred. Let's go a little deeper into the comparisons here. Representative Upton, reflecting on your tenure in the House of Representatives, how would you describe any changes you have observed in Congress' capacity to fulfill its responsibilities effectively?
Well, there's a lot of changes that have happened in the 36 years since I was there. I've been out 2 years, really, almost 2.5. And, sadly, and Fred has referenced this, the bipartisanship doesn't seem to be there. I mean, at the end of the day, it was easy when I first went to the Congress, and I said to my staff, of which my chief of staff was from Holland, by the way, and she was with me 36 years, and I had lunch with her today. She lives back in St. Joe now. But back then, I told my staff, I said, I'm not fighting windmills here, If the bill isn't going to move, I don't really care to be involved in it. We want to work together. So every piece of legislation that I introduced or was part of was almost without exception, was bipartisan. I had great relations, still do, with members on the other side, as well as my Republican colleagues as well. But I can remember one of the first bills that I worked on was with a guy by the name of Kwesi Mfume. Mm-hmm. Kwesi, I was probably the only Republican that knew how to spell it, let alone say it correctly. He represented my mother-in-law in Baltimore. Right. He left the Congress to head the NAACP.
Right. Sure did.
And he was reelected to the Congress 2 or 3 terms ago, after he was out for about 12 years. And Kwesi, I went to him, I said, Kwesi, I care about the disabled. And Paul Hilligans is here, and he was a leader when we passed in Michigan the bill legislating that all new buildings had to be designed to be accessible for the disabled. We were the landmark state for that. No one else beat us. Paul was a leader on that, particularly as a Speaker of the House. And I said, there's a tax bill that was moving. Russ and Kowski was the chairman. And I thought, we ought to have our small businesses in all of our towns, Holland, St. Joe, Berrien Springs. They didn't want to discriminate against the disabled, but they didn't have the money to put in the bars, to change the bathrooms, to widen the doors, to put in, the sidewalks. So I said, let's do a tax credit, not a deduction, a tax credit for small businesses that had to make structural changes to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act. I got it in one sentence down, so you could, face somebody. And I went to Kwesi, and he became my lead Democrat co-sponsor. And we got the Black Caucus. We got all the folks. I lobbied all these members. We got 218 co-sponsors on the bill. Yes. And Ross and Kowski came up to me and said, "Upton," gravelly voice, "your bill's going to move. You did a good work on this, and it's going to happen." It became law. And so a month or two later, Kwesi came up to me and grabbed my lapels. He's a small guy, but he shook me on the floor and he said, "Upton, you have ruined my reputation. I'm a progressive Democrat, and I could run and win on just being a 0 with the Chamber of Commerce in terms of my voting record. It's now a 20 because of what you did. I'm going to have a primary." But he said that obviously with a big smile. But that's how you get things done. I can cite lots of examples like that. That's not the case today. Mm-hmm. Today, they just passed, a week or so, 2 weeks ago now, this 1,100-page bill. It's a couple, $8 trillion, I'm rounding here. Nobody read it. Nobody saw it. Didn't have any committee hearings, subcommittee hearings. It had late-night markups that literally went 30 consecutive hours, and you saw pictures of people asleep, Republicans as well as Democrats. Yeah. That's not how you govern. Not on something that's as important like this. You need exposure. You need transparency. People need to know what's in the bill before they vote for it. And the vote was like at 7 in the morning after being in session since noon the previous day. Some people missed the vote because they were asleep and they couldn't find them. And frankly, it would not have passed had a Democrat member, Jerry Connolly from Virginia, not died 48 hours before, and there's not been a special election to replace him yet, so it was 1 vote. That's what we're dealing with today. And that's not what Mike Denikus taught me back in ninth grade. And it's not like what you saw Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, I mean, a movie that most of us remember. And that's how it's changed. It has become so partisan that it's really tragic, because it's the American people that have lost versus being able to stand on your own 2 feet and say what's in the bill, what's out of the bill, you know, amendments that are in an open process as long as it's germane to the overall bill. That's been the big change from when I was elected in '86 to where we are today.
Right.
So, Professor Johnson, can we look at American history? Are there periods when Congress experienced significant challenges related to political polarization or operational difficulties that might compare to the context of our contemporary observations that Representative Upton just talked about?
Yes.
Yes. Could you elaborate?
Next question.
And, well, in preparing for this evening, I mean, there's, as I mentioned to you, Claudia, the good news is that there's so many examples, and the bad news is that there are so many examples. But the one that I chose, the one that will be most, I think, relevant for our contemporary memory, remember a thing called Watergate? Yeah. Watergate happened still in the shadow of the Vietnam War. So two things happening in Watergate. One, the war is still going on when Watergate happened. Two, the civil rights movement is just ending. So two major cultural events, anti-war movement, civil rights movement, and look, let's be just frank about this. A lot of people are not, especially Southerners, are not happy about the results of the civil rights movement. The 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And then came Watergate. Frank Wells, a black guard, discovered an attempt to break into the Democratic National Headquarters, and that was in June 1973. In May 1973, Barry Goldwater eventually said that, now Barry Goldwater, the guy that ran for the presidency in 1964, the one who was called an extremist, he said, if it can be proved that Nixon lied, resignation would have to be considered, it would be quick. Everything would be over, ended. It wouldn't drag out like impeachment. And then, in August 1974, once the investigation was underway, at the regular Senate Republican conference lunch, Goldwater then said, there are only so many lives you can take, and now there's been one too many. Nixon should get his rear end, the actual quote didn't say rear end, out of the White House today. Then in August 1974, now try and imagine this happening today, with a president, an imperial president that overreaches the Constitution. Senator Barry Goldwater, Senate Minority Leader Hugh Scott of Pennsylvania, another Republican, Republican House Minority Leader John Rhodes of Arizona, all went down to the White House, from the Hill down to the White House, and told President Nixon, you have lost support on Capitol Hill. We don't support you. We're going to join Democrats because this is about a constitutional crisis that you have violated. The reason why, I don't know about you, but the reason why I can't imagine that happening today, because something like that takes courage and integrity. So on August 9, 1974, President Nixon resigned. Congressman Upton mentioned the bipartisanship. The 1964 Civil Rights Act was a perfect example of that. Lyndon Johnson, Democratic president, told his chief staffers to get in touch with Senator Everett Dirksen, a Republican from Illinois, a small government Republican, and told him, if you can get Dirksen on this thing, you got to get him to get this bill through. Everett Dirksen, the Republican, was key to passing the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And Johnson told his people that you got to get him on there, and Everett Dirksen finally led that charge and said, and when the bill finally passed, he said the time had finally come to do it. Everett Dirksen was one of those old-style Republicans who thought it was more to stay in the tradition of Abraham Lincoln than just to grind an axe on party issues. And then the last example I have of constitutional crisis and the Congress would be the secession winter of 1861 in the aftermath of Abraham Lincoln's election from November 1860. It had been the first time. Slavery was the issue back then. And as early as 1820, Thomas Jefferson, because the debate had been so contentious, said we have the wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Country was on the verge of civil war in 1820. It was going to happen 41 years later. But in the secession winter of 1861, the Congress had pretty much fallen apart. And so different delegates from different states sent representatives to Washington to hold an extra congressional meeting to try and find compromise one more time. They obviously failed because the Civil War came. Now, in all those instances, despite the level of success or failure that the Congress had, the one thing Congressman Upton said that was applicable in each one of those cases is that people wanted to govern. You follow what I'm saying? You have to want to govern, do the job, the unlovely, hard work of governing, not just sending something through quickly and getting it done under the wee hours of the morning. Governance is hard. The Founding Fathers designed this thing to be difficult and be contentious, and it is. That's why people are frustrated with it, but people of goodwill can get it done. We got to do a better job on who we send to do that job while we still can.
Thank you. Representative Upton, historically, the Michigan congressional delegation has been able to coalesce around key issues for our state, such as protecting the Great Lakes and maintaining a strong auto industry. Do you think that is still the case?
Well, I actually called a couple of my former colleagues in Congress today, but they were on their way back to Washington, so I didn't connect with them to ask them how things were going. I will tell you that I thought that my relationship with my Michigan colleagues was critical to getting things done. We generally had a meeting at least every month. I became the dean of the Republican delegation and worked very well with John Dingell, who is, frankly, the dean of the House, but also the dean of the Michigan delegation. Our offices were across the hall from each other, and we often walked to vote together. He was a great man looking out for Michigan's interests, and we had a fun time. We both have a sense of humor, and when we differed, we weren't afraid to jab each other in a fun way on whatever topic it might be, and we could laugh. And we were actually in a dinner club. You know, we had dinner together, and we talked about, you know, did you ever do this? The Dingells were part of that group that I met with probably every 6 weeks with our spouses. We had a potluck dinner at somebody's house. And so together we worked to make sure that everybody was in mind. We also had this rule called the Dingell rule. And that was, you didn't campaign against someone from the other party if you were from the same state. And sometimes that would be, someone would be in violation, and it would be pointed out to me by Big John, and I would go to that member and say, you know, you really can't do that. You know, you can't go to the UP and campaign against them, the Democrat Bart Stupak. That violates the Dingell rule, and you don't want to have that house of cards sort of come down. And he or his successor, Dan Kildee, became the dean a little bit later, and Dan just retired a year ago, now runs a foundation in Flint. He and I work very closely together on the Flint water crisis in a successful way. And I would go to Dan and say, Dan, you got one guy, I won't say who it is, but he's like campaigning against me. This is violating the Dingell rule, even though John Dingell's gone. And he'd say, okay, Fred, I'll go talk to him. And the governor would come. I mean, regardless of whether it was a Rick Snyder, or Granholm, or Gretchen, they would come and they'd want to sit in our meetings, and we were, you know, they worked. And we had, you know, when you looked at who we were positioned in such a way as a delegation that we had real strength. We were viewed as one of the top 4 or 5 delegations in the nation, even though we weren't in Illinois, in New York, in California, Florida, you know, et cetera. our numbers were smaller, yet we chaired or were ranking members, the top, in the minority, on key committees that nobody could beat, and also in our leadership. So things worked well, but I can't tell you how they work now. This next election in 26, it's going to be the first time in 100 years that someone running for a statewide office is not an incumbent. We're going to have a new governor, a new AG, a new Secretary of State, a new lieutenant governor, and a new U.S. senator. The first time all of our statewide offices are going to have not an incumbent being there. And my sense is that because Michigan is a purple state, and we've seen things flip one side to the other, state senate, et cetera, that it's going to be pretty contentious. My guess is, we have a late primary, August. You got a number of people running for governor and, U.S. Senate and, other spots. And my guess is the campaigns are going to get pretty nasty. I'm just guessing. They're going to be, I'm for campaign finance reform in a big way, but I'll bet particularly these outside groups, which are usually the ones that are slinging more mud than anybody else, and, you can't take them off the air, that people are going to be sick the end of July next year, looking at these TV ads that are really going to be pounding the other, and quite frankly, I think that a guy like Mike Duggan, who is pretty well acclaimed as the mayor of Detroit in terms of turning that around, he's running as an independent. He doesn't want to have anything to do with the party poobahs. And my sense is that if he keeps his nose clean and talks about a positive message, and I heard him on WJR last week at the Mackinac Conference, that he'll have a decent chance by not getting in the mud with the others. And the last thing is, if you look at Michigan, they just did a big poll in March. 31% of the Michigan voters say they identify with the Democrats. 31. 33%, or no, it's 34% with the Republicans. 35% with the independents. So he has a lane here that I think he could do quite well if party politics look to be like what I just predicted. But to your question about the delegation, you got to work together. The Great Lakes, I grew up on the Great Lakes. One of my first bills was oil spill legislation. And we got that done. We needed it, not only for the Great Lakes, but for the Kalamazoo River. We had an oil spill a couple years ago that I helped get cleaned up. The auto industry. John Niggle called me during the August recess. He goes, of course, John, he could have just opened the window and called me. But he used the phone. He said, Upton, we got a problem. The CEO from GM called you yet? I said, no, it's 6 a.m. And I said, well, but we worked together. We did the auto rescue plan, which saved Michigan. Nobody was going to bail us out. The money got paid back. Even Ford, who didn't get any money, they supported it because they knew all the suppliers were going to go under. And we saw both John McCain, and I was involved heavily in his campaign. I was one of his national chairs. And Barack Obama, Carl Levin was one of his national chairs. But the two of us, Levin and me, worked on getting both McCain and Obama to write an op-ed in the Detroit News saying why it was so important that we see this auto rescue plan move forward. Those are what really, in Michigan, you would have turned out the lights. I mean, there is no question we'd been in a deep, deep recession. And those are the issues where you really have to count on Republicans and Democrats coming together on behalf of not only the state, but also of the nation. And I hope that we have that now in the mix. We have fewer members. They don't have the baseball bats, the clout that we had when I was in my heyday as chairman of Energy and Commerce. And we had Dave Camp as chairman of Ways and Means. We had Candace Miller. We had Pete Hoekstra chaired the Intel Committee. Mike Rogers chaired the Intel Committee. We don't have those power players like we had Dave Bonnier, who was the Democratic whip. We don't have those folks in place like we did before, but hopefully if some crisis comes, they can get their act together and work with the governor, Republican or Democrat, to get things done.
Thank you. Right. Yeah. Very true what you had relayed there. Professor Johnson, when comparing any such historical periods to the present, what notable similarities or differences do you identify that might be relevant to understanding Congress's ability to function?
In the case of, I mentioned the case of Watergate, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and the Vietnam War. In all those cases, the Congress's function mirrored the mood of the country. People wanted out of the Vietnam War, so legislation was eventually passed, establishing the War Powers Act, limiting the powers of the president, based on the 1964 Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which pretty much gave LBJ a blank check to wage war in Vietnam. In the case of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, it was the new technology back then of television, still fairly new technology. People could not believe, in the case of, for example, James Word, a young guy from Wisconsin, could not believe what he saw on TV happening in his America. Now, James Word was from Madison, Wisconsin, but the mood of the country was such that people knew that the country they fought for in World War II, this was not the country they fought for. So the time it finally arrived, and despite the fact that there were a massive number of Democrats called Dixiecrats who were opposed to that legislation, it passed. As I mentioned before, LBJ got with Everett Dirksen and made that work in a bipartisan way. In the case of Watergate, the country was just exhausted with Vietnam, recovering from still trying to adjust to the fact that JFK had been shot down in 1963, that his brother, King, had been shot down in 1968, followed by Bobby Kennedy, then the revelations from the Pentagon Papers, the Tet Offensive. People were just exhausted. So the Congress was able to move according to those social conditions. But likewise, the Congress helped to also enshrine the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson case that established the principle of separate but equal throughout the entire South and many cases in the North. Again, the mood of the country was, coming out of Reconstruction, this is what people want, so the representatives from the people did just that. So first-class citizenship was, second-class citizenship was reserved for about 80, 90 years. In a more immediate sense, if we're looking at, like right now, this moment, if you just refer to January 6, 2021, okay? That mob that assaulted the Congress. In 1995, I think 1995, 1996, remember a thing called the Million Man March? Not one incident of violence. And let me be frank with you all. There were people who were worried about 1 million black men on the Capitol. What can't go wrong, they thought. Nothing happened. However, on January 6, 2021, the question to ask is, how did that mob that gathered there know they could do that and get away with it? What told them you can assault the Congress and do that as part of your citizens' duty, your right? The answer is not nearly as important as the question. What made you think you could do that? In 1995, what made you refrain from doing anything like that? And because people did that, and they were able to change the narrative on that, and then people inside the Congress went along with that, we should not be at all surprised that buying into that fiction has also produced some other activities that challenge credulity. So the function is directly dependent upon what's happening in society. The Congress is, because it's representative government, representing the best and worst of us. Right now, we need to be better.
Thank you. Representative Upton, have you observed...
Why do I always go first? I'm just kidding.
What?
Never mind. Go.
What
go.
would you like me, Fred?
No. Go.
Have you ever observed changes in how Congress is performing And what factors do you believe have contributed to those shifts?
Yeah, so two quick things. One, when I was first elected, so remember my background, I worked for the Reagan administration. I worked at the Office of Management and Budget, OMB. And we were the ones responsible, still are, for actually setting up the president's budget. And that would drive the whole legislative process, okay? It really ruined your New Year's because it came up like January 2nd was when the budget came up to Capitol Hill. And I worked in the Legislative Affairs Office. I later ran that office. And it was my responsibility to make sure that the chairman of the Budget Committee got their budget the same time as their counterpart on the other party. And the same thing with the Senate, because everyone wanted to scour that 1,000-page document that was line by line every function within the federal government. And that came up on literally New Year's Day. We got to track members down. Where are they going to be? Get sworn in on January 3rd, so they got to have the budget. Well, guess what? This year, the budget still isn't up there. It's June 2nd. They did a skinny budget a couple weeks ago that was 39 pages. It didn't include money for defense or any other thing, but there's no line items there in a 39-page document when you got number of employees and all the different programs that you have and literally trillions of dollars of spending and all. It still isn't up. The process then is bogged down. The fiscal year ends September 30th. So the new budget is supposed to be adopted by then. This is for fiscal year 26. And so usually by this point in June, the Congress has done, there's a difference between an authorization and an appropriation. Authorization is you sort of figure out what the program changes are going to be. The appropriation actually funds it. So there's an authorization process that the committees do, and then, of course, the Appropriations Committee fills and does the spending. Usually by about now, the authorizations are finished. They've gone through the Congress. They've had their subcommittee hearings and markup. They've had their vote on the House floor. This was early on when I was in Congress. It's not now. And already at this point, the easier appropriation bills, there's 12 of them. One's foreign aid, one's agriculture, et cetera. One's the legislative branch. The easy ones go first, and the more contentious ones go a little bit later in June and July. And when those come, when they came, you'd have, the Democrats were in charge. They'd have someone very responsible be the Speaker of the House, the Speaker pro tem, because the Speaker usually isn't, he assigns it to somebody else. And anyone could offer an amendment on the appropriation bill. It had to be germane. You're not going to have a F-16 amendment on an agriculture bill, okay? Mm-hmm. But if you're going to add to spending, so I want to add money, Upton amendment on adding money for the Great Lakes research, I'd have to find a cut of the same amount in the same appropriation bill to offset that so that the deficit wouldn't go up. Otherwise, everyone would just offer spending, but you had to come up with the offset. And those more contentious bills, complex bills, would take a whole week on the House floor, a whole week. And there was a great guy, the chairman was Bill Natcher, and he was usually the one in the chair, the Speaker's chair, because he'd be very fair. And you got members that are viewed as some are more partisan than others, but you got some very fair members on both sides. I was often up there for some of the contentious bills because they knew that I would be fairly, as we debate these bills. But that's what we did. It was an open process, so you weren't discriminated against if you weren't on the Appropriations Committee. One of the Appropriations, Ways and Means, and Energy and Commerce are the three biggest, most important committees in the House. And you wanted to have a say, again, if your amendment was germane, to do that. It's not happening anymore. In fact, there's no amendments to any of these bills. It's whatever. In fact, what's happened today is they're not even, I'll bet, that they don't bring up a single appropriation bill this summer. all right? It'll be one big continuing resolution, or CR. And will there be any amendments to it? No. Not a single amendment will be offered to what could be maybe a $6 trillion bill in the House. Different than what we did, 12 separate bills. Anyone, Republican or Democrat, could offer amendments that were germane, and the process moved forward. Before it went then with conference with the Senate, they would do the same thing. We got the bills done. That is the huge change that has happened in the last 40 years.
Wow.
We'll probably discuss more of that during our Q&A from the audience. Professor Johnson, in the historical periods you've discussed where Congress faced significant operational challenges, what developments or factors contributed to changes in those conditions?
Let me preface this by quoting from Representative Barbara Jordan, who spoke on July 24th, 1974, at the House Judiciary Committee. She said, "My faith in the Constitution is whole. It is complete. It is total. And I am not going to sit here and be an idle spectator to the diminution, the subversion, the destruction of the Constitution. Who can so properly be the inquisitors for the nation as the representatives of the nation themselves? The subject of its jurisdiction are those offenses which proceed from the misconduct of public men, in other words, from the abuse or violation of some public trust." What she was talking about and what happened afterward relative to Congress's ability to function and therefore government's ability to function, in the aftermath of Watergate, that generation of lawmakers passed a series of measures designed to protect Article I powers and limit the chief executive. New protections to prevent the federal civil service from being politicized. A 10-year term for the FBI director to limit political interference. Laws that were enacted to place inspectors general in federal agencies to ensure compliance and transparency. The creation of an office of government ethics and office of special counsel as watchdogs to keep an eye on the executive branch. Laws passed to ensure checks on executive power. Increased transparency in government. Campaign finance reform. Ethics and oversight. Protection of whistleblowers. Limitations on executive privilege. And needless to say, beefing up the emoluments clause about people taking gifts from foreign powers or princes, like 747s. All these happened in the aftermath of Watergate. And each one of these things, the firing of inspectors general, the terrorizing and politicization of the federal workforce, the not transparency but the obscuration of things going on like Congressman Upton talked about in the legislative process. All these things are beginning to filter down into the bedrock of what's going on inside that building to include how you pass a bill. Okay, now he clearly has an expert on how that's done, but the overall concept of it was that he passed these laws to make sure that not just the overreach of executive power, but the legislative process as well would be made more open, accountable, and have watchdogs attached to it. Those things have been dismantled and are being dismantled as we speak. And the result, therefore, is you have less transparency, less oversight, greater reach of power, and that invites a question of ethics, to say the least.
I want to go back to my question because
Sure.
I mentioned campaign finance. I mean, that's the other big thing. I mean, as I think about my 36 years, my first election, and Rob Pocock is here. Rob was one of my county chairs in Ottawa County. When I first ran, I beat the only incumbent to lose in the country in a primary. We were outspent 3-1. We spent $100,000 in that race. We had a lot of issues that we raised. A couple of big things happened at the end which really helped us. We won 56-44. But there's no way you can run a campaign so I had 25 contested elections, 7 primaries, And now, you're looking at races that, for a House seat, are generally between $8 and $10 million.
Right.
Now, figure it out. Individuals are capped, all right? And it goes up with inflation. The most, I think this year, an individual can give, I think it's $2,800. It's a lot of $2,800 contributions that you have to raise to get up to 10 million people, or 10 million bucks.
Yeah.
PACs, people hear about bad things about PACs. They have been capped for 20 years, $5,000. That's the most they can give, and those corporate contributions are always banned, always have been banned. But when you have to raise, for an average House race, 10 million, I had to do that at the end. I think I might have raised 12 million. Our district was a swing seat because I had all of Kalamazoo County. Pretty Democratic, but we did pretty well there. I was reminded, I had 50,000 more votes than Trump did. Clinton won my district, Obama won my district. But when you have to raise $10 or $12 million for an average House seat, and we were always going to win, but we knew that if we sat on our hands, we wouldn't. But you take some of these other races, special elections, maybe you got a couple months to raise 12, 15, even 20 million. Oh,
Yeah.
I thought you were going to make policy. I thought you were going to help constituents.
Yep.
I thought you were going to go, do your service clubs and events like this. Not sit in a phone booth or sit in now you don't have phone booths, now you got the cell phones. And just dial for dollars all the time, and you're not even dialing in the same area code. You're like, you're in Florida, or you're in Texas, and you're in California. And I mean, it's like, whoa. I mean, it is so out of, I don't want to say out of, it's legal, but the problem is the courts have allowed this to happen, and it's pretty hard to put genie back in the bottle.
Right.
Because you have the Constitution, something I always first started, First Amendment.
Yeah.
How come I can't give so-and-so 100,000? In Virginia, they don't have the rules that we have here in Michigan. If you want to give the gubernatorial candidate, Abigail Spanberger is running, $100,000, you can, if you want to. You have to report it, but I mean, it is just incredible what these campaigns cost. And then you see those mailers and go, I know that woman. That just doesn't look like that. I mean, you get stuff in the mail. I mean, it's like, and it's gone down to school board and all these other races, and it's just like, it would be nice to do like the English do, like 60 days and we're done, and you're not going to spend that much money. I think that would pass in maybe we can get a constitutional amendment on that. But that's the other big change that has happened in the 36 years.
And I believe that change has probably brought us to the next question. And it's a question for either one of you, so maybe Professor Johnson wants to start with it. But voter trust in institutions is at a historic low. What might we be able to do to reverse that? Either one of you can. I stumped him.
Well, I want to, what I want to do, Claudia, I don't want to just, give some off-the-cuff glib response, because it sounds so basic and fundamental, but we have a crisis in our relationship with the truth. Okay? I mentioned the January 6th insurrection a few moments ago. Even more to the point, if you can have people, say, for example, John McCain was called not a hero, and people went along with that. People in Arizona went along with that. John McCain, the son and grandson of admirals, who flew from an aircraft carrier in October 1967, shot down just several years in the Hanoi Hilton. I've taken students to visit the Hanoi Hilton. It's nowhere near the prison that it once was, but even today in its reduced form, it's still pretty horrific. The Vietnamese have a stone plaque next to the river, next to the lake where John McCain was fished out of that river. They consider him to be a hero. But John McCain was called not a hero because he was captured. John McCain was given the option of coming home. If he just signed the paper and speak against his country, he chose to stay. John McCain was never able to lift his arms above this height for the rest of his life because of what happened to him when he ejected from that aircraft. When people are willing to go along with that, and presumably they know better, but they choose to go along with a lie, then where are you supposed to find trust? Because trust also involves being able to see a thing and know a thing and believe that a thing is a thing. So if you can have the entire planet seeing the Congress being assaulted, and then it be told they were just tourists. Something happened on that day that never happened in 4 years of fratricidal civil war. That was the Confederate flag made it inside the chambers. During the Civil War, the closest that flag got was Stevensville, Maryland, 7 miles outside the Capitol. But that day, it made it inside the building. Those were not tourists. And yet, when people have the power to change the narrative, and people just are willing to nod and go along with it, the crisis of trust is not necessarily with the Congress anymore, it's with the people who know better and are believing it, and the peddlers of those lies.
Very true. So just a quick thing, I got to tell you a little story about John McCain, because he was a dear friend. He sent me to New Hampshire, and I went there for a couple weeks at his campaign in, I guess it was 2008, and helped turn it around. And then he asked me to go to North Dakota, and I said, what did I do wrong? So he sent me to Cleveland. But I was with him a lot. I flew with him. I was with him on Super Tuesday. I flew back with him after he won, back to D.C. And you're right. And when we were campaigning, you know, it was funny, too. I'll tell a little story on John Engler. He was for somebody else. I don't remember who. But anyway, I was on a conference call, and Engler goes, oh, this is on election day. He said, the polls are looking good. We're getting some advanced polling, and McCain's looking a lot stronger here than we thought. What's going on out there? What the hell's going on? I go, good things, Governor. It's Upton. Oh, you're not supposed to be on this call. But I remember we went up to Traverse City on election day, and it was a snowy day, and we had all the media with us, and the media loved them. And we went to this school for this polling place, and we said, well, we'll go there at 7 in the morning when people are first going, so they get the camera shot. We pull up, he's got a little minivan that he's in, and so I go, okay. He said, no, you don't let me get out. I can't because of my arms. If I fall, I'm dead. So we saw a house at the end of the street in the next block. And the snow was like this high, and you could walk through it. Someone had been through there with, the snow was up that high, so you'd like a tunnel almost. There was this really nice house that we saw, all lit up, pillars in the front, big front porch. So John said, somebody's up over there. Let's, no one was at this polling. Let's go. Come on, Upton. Let's go, Freddie. So we started hiking through the snowbank. And as we got closer and closer, we saw it was a funeral home. The press loved it. They thought, oh, my God. And the owner came out, and I was so glad they didn't have like a body that was like an open casket inside. Because, oh, man. All right. Anyway, so to answer your question, sorry I deviated.
Yes.
We got to get people to vote. Mm-hmm. When we do that primary in Michigan next August, a year from now, maybe 50, they're going to see all the negative ads, and they'll say, we don't like any of these guys. They're going to be about a 20% turnout. So that means you need 11%. Well, actually, there'll be multiple candidates. So you probably need about 7% of the electorate to win the primary. That's disgusting. And they're going to make it harder to vote. Let me just tell you, they're going to make it harder to vote than they have before.
Yes.
We were the first motor voter state. Our voters, us, me, I voted for it, so that you could register when you got your driver's license. It's easy. So we got more of those voters out there than ever before, but people aren't voting because they're disgusted with the system. So that's what we have to do. We have to get every citizen alarmed one way or another. And we don't need, division, fights.
Yes.
We had a protest at my office every week for 3 or 4 years in St. Joe. And there were fights outside. The police had to be called. At the end of the day, we had to lock our office and because we had people storm our office and actually shove my staff to the ground in Kalamazoo. And that is very unsettling.
Yes.
And somehow we have to restore the sense of civic duty. And whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or an independent, live with each other, all right? Have constructive debates and arguments that are not divisive, and keep them your friends. That's what we have to do to really get our person. In Oregon, they don't have polling places. It's all by mail. And their turnout is like, I'm not kidding, 75%. Everyone mails their ballot in. Now, we got a certain person that doesn't want mail ballots. I know that. But, hey, during COVID, I did my absentee ballot. I live less than a mile away from my city hall. But there's a drop box there. There's a police station inside City Hall. It's got a camera there. No one disturbs that box. Whether you're putting in your tax payment or, paying your water bill or voting. We need more of that. We need to make it easier for people to vote. And frankly, mail voting is a way to do it. And states that have it sure outshine people in our state.
You're right. Okay, do you have
All right.
you have a comment, Fred?
Yes.
And then look at all these questions
Yes.
the
All
right.
audience has for
Yes.
you all.
I'll keep the win short. This is from George Washington's farewell, 1797. 1797. George Washington was Supreme Commander of the Continental Army that fought the Revolution from 1775 to 1781, the Peace Treaty in 1783. It's a long farewell, but in it he said this, among other things. Towards the preservation of your government and the permanency of your present happy state, it is necessary not only that you readily refuse irregular oppositions to its acknowledged authority, but also that you resist with care the spirit of upheaval upon the principles, however misleading the process. One method of assault may be to effect, in the forms of the Constitution, alterations which will impair the energy of the system and thus to undermine what cannot be directly overthrown. That is, George Washington somehow knew that, is warning us that someday a situation may arise where somebody not from without beyond the shores, but somebody from inside our system will take the tools of government to dismantle government. And the only thing that could stop that, Abraham Lincoln said during the Civil War, we can't be defeated from the outside, we got to do it from within. We cannot be defeated from the outside. He's saying that in the middle of the 19th century. Our greatest fear or concern has been from within. That's why when people join the military, they take an oath to do what? Uphold and defend the Constitution against from all enemies, foreign and domestic. They exist. That requires us to have courage. That requires us to not make the mistake of the character in Herman Wouk's Winds of War, who, talking to the Swiss priest, he asked the question, why didn't more Jews leave Nazi Germany when it was clearly apparent that Hitler was going to become the monster that he was? And the priest said to him, it's the will to not believe. They simply could not imagine that things would get as bad as it could happen, even though they were seeing it before their very eyes. If it did get that bad, they couldn't leave. Can I make a suggestion? I suggest we not let it get that bad.
We have about a half an hour and lots of questions, so I
We'll
will
try to
just...
be brief.
Okay.
Yes.
I will just put them out there, and if you want to respond, raise your hand. How's that? But this is for you, Representative Upton. What communications from constituents do legislatures actually pay attention to?
Good question.
You want to...
You know, every member is different, all right? Every member is different. Their style, the staff that they have, the things that they do, the energy that they put into it. For me, I signed my name, the reason I go by Fred was I signed my name more than 1 million times to letters, 36 years. I can remember my mom stopping at a gas station and he saw this guy then it was not self-serve, so it was early in my career. And this guy said, he saw my mom's Upton bumper sticker, and he said, I got a letter from that guy. And I knew it was him because I went like this, and it smeared his name. I just did Fred, but I knew in my mind about what the count was. I was home virtually every week. I did lots of, from town halls to service clubs to man on the street to look like you and me, grocery store. I love to go to Myers. I got a sense of where our district was. Mm-hmm. My staff tried to be courteous to all the calls coming in. They took a log. It changed a lot, so now it's much more internet. Email is something. You're not sure where people are from because, your email doesn't say St. Joe, Michigan on it. Who knows where it's from. But the best way to communicate is actually get to know your member of Congress. Yeah. And, whether you go to church with them or you see them at the market or you know that they're coming to speak at some group, go there and buttonhole them. They want to hear from you. All right? They do. No. They should. All right? Time out. Time out. They should. There's a reason that I go to Martin's and Myers, all right? There's a reason that, I wanted to hear from people. I wanted to get a sense of how the administration was doing or how things were impacting their lives or doing constituent casework, calling mayors. You wanted an aggressive staff as well. And I demanded that my staff call me Fred because anyone that came to Washington had an automatic appointment. If they let us know they were coming in advance, bingo, yep. Upton's like a doctor, it's 15 minutes, someone will be at the door knocking and say, Fred, your next appointment's here, which was true. But even if I was in committee, they would take those constituents down to my committee room, and I'd step out in the hallway to at least say hello. That's great. Watch us in action. That is the most effective way, so people can convey what they want, lobby what they want, whatever the issue is. We shut the door on groups that didn't have constituents. You have a group that might be from Michigan, but say, well, who's there from the district? They had to be there from the district because we represented 750,000 people. But that's the best way, is to actually find them. They shouldn't run and hide. I was on street corner. One of the things that we did on election day, I was on the street corner. I was encouraging people to vote. I would be out from 6:30 in the morning until 7 at night. That's when the traffic got a little bit lower. But we'd be Kalamazoo, we'd be Holland, we'd be St. Joe, and I would be out there, and people would stop. Sometimes I get that finger, but I rode with President Bush through our district, and You know, we went through one town that was fairly democratic. He said, "Oh, they're giving me a high sign." I said, "No, that's the wrong finger." He laughed. It was Bush 43. I don't know if Bush 41. Actually, anyway, I won't tell the story about 41. But anyway, but you should be able to find us. That's who we are, and that applies to your state reps and your state senators as well. Much smaller districts, but there's no reason for you not to, be able to weigh in.
Let me ask Professor Johnson, why aren't the court decisions being enforced? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't know exactly why the court decisions are not being enforced. So let me speculate. I think if you look at the pattern of what's been happening so far, there is a constant attempt to test and probe and see what can be gotten away with. I give this analogy of a car that's been pumped up by a jack for maybe changing the tire. Someone comes along and then takes the jack and moves it up the way to see will it fall this time. So there's a concerted attempt to overwhelm the system all at once. It's understood that the courts move at a certain pace, which for many people is not fast enough. So passing executive orders and doing things that are striking in many different areas at the same time is a way of overwhelming the system that causes it to short circuit and possibly to get people so frustrated they just give up their hands and walk away from it and leave it alone to self-manage itself. And that, of course, is what Congressman Upton was talking about, we cannot do. People need to pay attention. And to borrow a quote from James Madison, who said that if men were angels, there would be no need for government. Men are clearly not angels. There's a need for government. Can I just tell y'all, too, one of the reasons I'm excited to do this is because I'm excited to sit beside somebody who's actually won an election.
I have a lot of questions here for Congressman Upton or Representative Upton, and they all have to deal with why aren't the Republicans or the Democrats holding Trump accountable for the campaign promises he made, such as, we'll end the war in Ukraine on my first day. You both
Well,
can
we hear that a
answer
lot.
that.
I mean, I was watching TV this weekend, and I heard at least the pundits talk about that on some of the Sunday shows when I got home from church yesterday. There's just so much going on. It seems like there's just a zillion things that's sort of being thrown at the wall, and some are sticking and some are not.
Yeah.
You almost don't want to watch the news in the morning or at night when you get home. Eventually it catches up with you, okay? And, things are so closely divided. I get the question, and maybe it's in there too, why don't they, with all these executive orders, why can't they overturn some of these? Well, to do so, first of all, that's why the power of the speaker is so important, because he or she decides the legislative schedule for the week.
Yes.
It's hard to get around that. There's a way you can do it, and it's been successful. But even if you brought a bill up to, say, reverse something, you have the vote, maybe it passes. Maybe it gets through. The Senate just did something on tariffs, all right, a couple weeks ago. It passed. But, oops, that was my mic here. But it's still working. So the Senate passed it narrowly. But the Speaker said, we're not bringing that bill up. And it's not coming. So how does it get to the President then to reverse it? And even if it did, I'm monkeying with this thing, he'd veto it. And there are not the 2/3 vote to override him in both the House and the Senate. So it's like a windmill. You're racing windmills. It's not going to happen. So now this whole thing is coming off. I don't know. You know what? It's looped. It's tied me to this chair.
You're not leaving
There.
without
No, I'm
answering
not
all
leaving.
the questions.
Wait. Can you hear me now still? Yeah. I don't know. So,
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
so that's what's,
I think they
you know,
can't
these,
hear you because somebody's not hearing you.
where's Josh? You answer this question, then I'll come back.
Fill
Where's
in
Josh?
here.
Oh, here.
Go ahead.
Well, think about that for a second. The war in Ukraine on the one day.
Go ahead, Fred.
One day. One day. How about this? How about this? It is an insult to our foreign service career professionals to say such a thing. It underestimates Vladimir Putin. We need to remember Vladimir Putin, during the Cold War, was in East Germany with the KGB. He lived through the fall of the Soviet Union. He lived through the rise of the oligarchs. He lived through Boris Yeltsin. When Michael Medvedev was president, he'd be prime minister, then president. They switch all back and forth. But Vladimir Putin's been in charge all the time. Vladimir Putin is an old-style, old European dictator who's good at survival. He would have to be studied. You'd also have to know about the age-old relationship between Ukraine and Russia and Kyiv. To think you're just going to waltz in and end that war on the basis of your charm, well, it was ridiculous. So that kind of ridiculous statement is why you also see people being sent to South Sudan. You understand? South Sudan is one of the newest nations on earth. Sudan has been in crisis since the early 2000s when there was a genocide going on with the Janjaweed. So, like Congressman Upton was saying, or alluding to just a moment ago, it comes back again. The windmill analogy he was using, in order to get the votes to reverse some of this stuff, you got to have people in there to get the votes to get it done. They get there by what we do out here. So we should be taking not comfort, but we should count ourselves fortunate that for the moment, our votes still count. I don't want to catastrophize, but the two-thirds majority he's talking about doesn't happen unless there's a change of personnel through elections.
Well, Fred, I'm now unhooked from that thing that actually lassoed me here. Yeah. Fred, you mentioned a little bit earlier about some of the members that went down and talked to Richard Nixon back in '74.
Right.
Jerry Ford was one of them. Great credit to Ford, and of course, he gave him the pardon, which, healed the country. And I think you need some people that can go down and talk some sense into this administration on some things. And so, Afghanistan, I don't know if you saw over the weekend, or maybe it was a week ago, but the administration is talking about ending the visas for the Afghans who helped our troops during that long war. Yes. These were translators. They were working at our bases. Yes. I went to Afghanistan.
Yes.
I mean, talk about a third world country. You had to have people like that to help us try to prevail. And of course, it ended up in the disaster that it did. We all recognize that. But can you imagine sending those people back 6-7 years later and give them to the Taliban? What do you think they're going to do? Dead.
Yes.
Gone. Sending people to Sudan.
Yes.
I mean, Ukraine, they're talking about sending the Ukrainians back.
Yes.
Who are here, it's mostly women. Men can't leave. They're
right.
conscripted. So it's protecting their families so they're not victims of this indiscriminate bombing that Putin continues to do every day. I mean, I saw today, there's a New York Times story where the president talked about Biden was dead. He died in 20. Did you see that? How many people saw this? Yeah. Biden died in 20, and he was replaced by a clone, right? Or robot. Trump tweeted that on his thing this weekend. I mean, and the White House is refusing to comment on it. You know, they got asked that, I guess, at the press conference today, and they no comment. I mean, who is running this place?
We're laughing about that, but can I just recommend to you all, there's a movie called Downfall, which is based on the end of World War II. And there's one scene toward the end where Adolf Hitler is talking about, imaginary forces that he's going to send this wing here, send General Steiner here. They're not there. Those forces don't exist. Germany's defeated. And yet everyone in that room, even though they know the war's lost, even though they know the Russians are coming from the east, the British and the Americans are coming from the west, they're sitting there still too afraid to confront the monster with the truth. So therefore, the killing goes on. And when you look at that, you have to ask, the worst that could have been done had already been done, and still they refuse to say something until the absolute worst that could have been done was done. We can't afford to let that happen. I have been telling people that for the last 2 or 3 years, my biggest concern has been the preservation of this Republican democracy. So that's why sometimes when I talk about George Washington, people go, oh, Fred, he owned slaves. I know he did. I wish he hadn't, but he did. But that does not mean that what he gave us, an example of leadership that still should not be admired to this day. George Washington had the integrity to walk away at the height of his power when many people would have encouraged him and would have been happy to see him stay as president for life. He gave us that precedent, walking away from it. And so, that's all.
You're going to, what do we do?
I didn't mean to interrupt, but for those of you that didn't see the story about Biden being killed, half of you that didn't raise your hand, look up when you get home tonight, Drudge Report, www.drudgereport.com, and it's got the New York Times story right there that outlines this. It's just like, I couldn't believe it. All right, next question.
Well, you've mentioned it, and you've mentioned courage. So who today has the courage to reduce our national debt and to lead us forward?
Well, again, going back to my early comments, the way to govern is bipartisanship.
Yeah.
I was asked by Speaker Boehner, we had this super committee, you might remember, 6 Republicans, 6 Democrats, 3 each from the House and the Senate, 12 of us. Dave Camp and I from Michigan were 2 of the 12. And we worked for months on a bipartisan package, but the deal was you had to get 7 votes of the 12. We got 6. Camp and I were together. Taxes were part of it, particularly for those that are on the wealthy side of things. And Boehner was very supportive of what we were trying to do, but at the end of the day, we could not get the 7th vote. And it would have been bipartisan. It would have then sent it to the House floor. I joked that I'm a Michigan Wolverine. I was going to make sure that there was going to be a Wolverine amendment. We were going to be in the college playoffs forever, but I didn't get a chance to offer that amendment. John Kerry said he'd support it because he knew that I was much happier when Michigan won than when we lost. But we spent a lot of time together, but that is the only way to get things done. You got to have buy-in from both sides. We know that tough choices have to be made. We know that we don't want to hurt the most vulnerable, particularly seniors who retired or are not able to continue to work, whether they be farm laborers or whatever. But we need to announce those changes at younger age groups. Growth has to be part of it. But to railroad something through where you only rely on Republican votes or Democrat votes is not the way to govern.
And so my final question then, as we end up, because all of these are very similar. But we have such divisiveness now in our country, and there has been the erosion of our checks and our balances. And while we all probably sit here and realize the importance of being bipartisan and working together, we really don't know how to do that. Do you think that our democracy will survive?
It better. You know, I'm a Cubs fan. You know, it did happen in my dad's lifetime, so it better. And you know, it just has to. I mean, we have a democracy. We're going to have, you know, yes, we have the midterm elections coming next year, but we got some elections coming before that. We had an election, you know, this last week in New York. State Senate seat flipped. We saw what happened in Wisconsin. We saw what happened in Florida. I mean, for Republicans, they're probably looking at about an 8 to 10 point slide right now. That means you're not going to keep the House, where the margin is in essence 220 to 215 if everybody's there. The Senate is stacked in favor of the Republicans. You know, a third of the Senate is up every 2 years, and it's Michigan is going to be one of those swing states. But the Democrats are not in a very good position based on the seats that are up, so that likely stays Republican. But at the end of the day, you have to work together. And that's the message that I think the voters are going to send, not only this fall in the elections. There's a special election or the off-year elections in Virginia and New Jersey. New Jersey is like next week, I think, or it's within 2 weeks. Virginia's, their primary is then, but you know, the generals for both states is in November. But I think you're going to see, you know, it's going to send a signal. They're going to be watching that as an early advance of, as they've watched it before. And, you know, I was very involved with the Problem Solvers Caucus. I was a vice chair of that. About 50 members. We were able to get a number of pieces of legislation through, including on immigration, that the Senate didn't take up. We needed immigration reform, no question. But No Labels is a group that I was a part of as well. That we looked at a unity ticket with a Republican and a Democrat. We actually saw a pathway where we could get 270 votes. We got pounded by the DCCC. They said, you're just going to elect Trump against Biden. I said, you guys better look at the polls because Trump's going to beat Biden. They didn't believe us. But that was, can you imagine if Biden had stayed in the race versus Harris? How it would have been, spread would have been a lot greater. So I think, and you look again at the polls in Michigan, 35% independent. I think it's going to be a wake-up call to both parties that they better get their act together and they better get off these tracks that has them really not where the majority of Americans are. And so, yeah, we're going to survive this. It's pretty rough right now, no question about it. We'll see what the courts do. And, you know, these are all executive orders, which means they get overridden real quick, day one, in the next administration if that happens. So just hold your breath. And we'll have men and women of courage step forward.
Yeah, I think.
Professor Johnson, do you have a final comment
Sure,
here?
Claudia. Will the democracy survive? I think so. Because
Your mic, here you continue.
Are you tied down?
I'm not. Okay, I think the democracy will survive because not on a broad scale, but I'm seeing here and there energy in the country of people who are getting active. Have you seen that before? It's very encouraging. People are active, sometimes not in the best way, but they're active, and they don't want to see the democracy end. And they are saying so. And I'm noticing that happen more and more. And I agree with Congressman Upton. It has to survive because with this proviso, the democracy has to survive so that first-class citizenship is available to everyone. Everyone. and the rule of law, and no one being above the law. The things that the Founding Fathers, that the people of the Revolutionary era fought for are not destroyed. I'll end. This is what gives me encouragement. Every now and then thinking about what Abraham Lincoln said when he said 80 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Then he said, now we are in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived can long endure. The president on that occasion was giving a nod to the fact that the American nation was an enduring experiment, never completed. This is still an experiment, ongoing change. The outcome of the experiment depends upon what we, the people, do. We will have a democracy if we want it, but we have to want it. It's not self-maintaining. Democracy is a full participation sport. And I'm glad that we've had good representation to do that. And if we want good representation, we have to simply demand it. And when we're not getting it, run for office. Do something, get involved. But democracy doesn't exist because of a magical experiment, a magic trick. It's because it's an intentional act of material application.
We are right on time, and I thank you all for giving us your attention tonight and for listening to the two Freds who have shared with us some very important facts. But it is up to each and every one of us in this room to vote for the change that we want and to stay focused in our efforts to attain that change, and to bring along with us people who also want change. It is going to take courage, as they mentioned, and it's going to take reaching across the aisle and talking with people. But with a group like this tonight, I can see that we are interested in finding ways to achieve the change that we wish. So I thank you very much for coming tonight. Thank you.